Welcome back to Beyond the Headline, everyone, where we discuss the realities of launching, scaling, and investing in a business. I'm delighted you're here today because I'm with the co-founder and CEO of Bomoda, Brian Buchwald. Thank you so much for being here, Brian.
It is great to be here and glad to be talking to you.
Brian, can we start out with you introducing us to what you guys are working on at Bomoda and how big of an opportunity there is in China for luxury retail brands?
Yeah, absolutely. So Bomoda is a business intelligence, or what we call a consumer intelligence platform, to help Western brands understand the purchase behavior and consumer behavior of Chinese consumers, and especially in the luxury sector, as you mentioned. So thinking about luxury apparel, automobiles, jewelry, beauty, etc. The reason why these consumers matter is they've become the #1 consumer in the world for luxury goods. So if traditionally we thought of the Japanese and the Americans as the primary buyers, now it's actually the Chinese. And they exhibit a lot of different characteristics. They exhibit a lot of different buying patterns relative to Western consumers that make them particularly interesting, but also particularly difficult for Western brands to both access, to understand, and ultimately to build relationships with. And that's what we specialize in. Our data, our software, our platform helps them do that.
And you really work hand in hand to partner with brands to shape their message and approach to the market.
Very much so. So we have one side of the business, which is pure platform, meaning that brands can basically buy our insights and our data, and we can provide that to them through a live platform. But we also have a services side of the organization. So oftentimes in these early days when a company is really trying to understand how they can grow with this incredibly important consumer base, they need more than just technology and data. And so we have a strategy side of the house and a content marketing side of the house that helps as well. And we've worked with some of the leading apparel brands, beauty brands, jewelry brands, lifestyle brands in the world, and it's been just a pleasure and an amazing learning experience for us, along with our brand partners.
One of the things that really stuck out to me when I was learning about your work is that brands need to take a long-term perspective when it comes to reaching out and communicating with Chinese consumers. 70 to 85% of what they're spending is happening outside of China. So can you give us a couple of examples of brands that you feel are doing a great job of that?
Yeah, I mean, so just take a step back for a second, just to think about the scale of what we're talking about. So one of the areas that we have a particular focus on is what we call the global Chinese consumer. And that's the consumer who may be buying in Shanghai or Beijing, but is also buying in Paris, in New York, in Los Angeles, in Honolulu, in Tokyo. And the reason why they matter is because last year, Chinese consumers took 100 million outbound trips, just over 100 million outbound trips, and they spent about $230 billion on their trips abroad. So we're talking about a massive consumer base. If Chinese consumers right now represent 40 to 50% of the global luxury market, 70 to 80% of their dollars, per your point, are spent outside of China. So it's critical for brands to rethink not just their communication strategy, which is really starting to focus on Chinese consumers and helping them understand their brands, the lifestyle behind those brands and the products, but also to geographically target them and help them through that path. And the reason why this is difficult is it's not traditionally what brands have done. It's not traditionally how the market has operated. But coinciding with that is the need to stick with it. So oftentimes, when there's a large growing market, a brand or a company will expect immediate results. And what we say is, you're in this for the next 25 to 50 years. It's important to start investing today. You obviously want to see some ROI, you want to see some value come relatively quickly, but this is a bet on the biggest new consumer base in the world, 1.5 billion people. It takes a while to really start to make a dent.
And when they're reaching out to people, you've had some great examples in previous interviews. So for example, Golden Week was just at the beginning of October, and instead of reaching out and putting out marketing campaigns, 2 or 3 weeks before, you want to do it way before, because a lot of these purchases are planned and deliberate.
That's right. So by the way, I didn't answer your early question. Certain companies doing particularly well today are brands like Burberry is doing a nice job, Chanel is doing a nice job, LVMH brands tend to do a pretty good job. So there are companies out there putting in the work, but per your point about Golden Week, yeah. So one of the differences between Chinese consumers and Western consumers is because they do so much of their buying when they travel, people typically don't travel to a foreign country on a whim. They're planning these trips months or even a year in advance. And that means by the time the Chinese consumer has landed in New York City or they landed in London, they've built a list over the last few months of exactly what they plan to buy and exactly where they plan to buy it. So there's a very small opportunity once they've hit the ground, or even once they're in execution mode of their trip, to actually influence them and change them. What you want to be doing is reaching them during the discovery and research phase, which could be a half a year before the actual trip. And that's why it's not just about, you want to be thinking about these milestone events like Golden Week, which is the largest outbound tourism week of the year for Chinese tourists, but you need to be thinking about it through the life cycle of the consumer, through daily activity and daily outreach, rather than just once a year or twice a year around Golden Week, for instance, and Chinese New Year.
And there's a lot of ways also during the times that they are in store to really provide a custom experience.
Very much so. So one of the challenges Western brands oftentimes have is they don't have Mandarin-speaking sales associates. So one of the things that we would definitely recommend is to have team members who can communicate with the consumer. But even if they can't, to understand that, for instance, Chinese consumers are often in a hurry because they're going to very specific stores. So you want to have the right merchandise lined up for them. You want to understand what they're looking for so that they can find that merchandise easily. You may want to have images of products that you know Chinese consumers are apt to buy. So even if there's a communication gap, you can show them images of what you know that they might be interested in. Also, oftentimes brands are using platforms like WeChat and Weibo, which are Chinese social media platforms, to communicate to these consumers before they touch ground in the States or in Europe or in Japan or Korea, so that they know directionally that the consumer is coming and that these are the types of products they're looking for. So there are lots of things that brands can do to make the buying experience both more streamlined but also more valuable to the consumer, both of which obviously redound to the benefit of the retailer and the brand.
What are you seeing, Brian, in terms of trends for the next couple of years? What can we look out for?
Yeah, so one of the key trends that we're seeing right now is the continued acceleration of Chinese consumer spend outside of China. So there have been kind of a few compounding events that have really driven this consumer abroad. So first has been the anti-corruption crackdown in China that's made it less advantageous for Chinese consumers to buy in market. And the second is political unrest in Hong Kong. Both of these have meant that the Chinese consumer is less apt to want to buy at home, more apt to want to go abroad. So we've seen really nice growth in Europe, in Japan, in Korea, even in the United States with Chinese tourists. We expect to see that to continue. We're also seeing really nice growth in areas like women's apparel, handbags, and shoes. So the early growth in the Chinese luxury market was very much tied to gifting, especially corporate gifting between government officials and private enterprise and state enterprise. And as the anti-corruption crackdown has occurred, there's been less buying, for instance, of expensive Rolex watches as gifts for fellow business people, but much more interest in Hermes scarves or in items that women may want to own because they like them, or items that men may want to buy for women or women may want to buy for men. There's something else that we've seen, which is pretty important, which is the younger consumer in China, and we expect that to continue. The younger consumer is much more independent. They're traveling much more than their older peers. And we have in China what's called the golden generation. And the golden generation is effectively, because of the one-child policy of the last few decades, it means that essentially there is one child in every family. So they have parents and grandparents now spending and lavishing them with many gifts and opportunities. The last thing I guess I'd mention from a trend perspective that also ties to this is this younger consumer is also much more interested in less blingy, quote-unquote, products, and much more interested in designer labels. So we see a consumer base getting much more knowledgeable and much more interested in relatively niche brands that their parents might never have touched because they would have never heard of them and they wouldn't have been able to explain it, for instance, to their friends.
something that I think lends really well to that is an insight you guys have shared previously that when it comes to the Chinese consumer today, as you mentioned, younger, her world is being created by her, shaped by her network, not by an authoritative third party. And I think that goes into the key opinion leaders that brands should be very interested in working with. Can you touch on that for a bit?
Yeah, you're really up to date on everything. It's been you know everything going on right now. One of the really interesting things about China is there's a basic distrust of general media or official media, and that means that the consumer is much more apt to listen to what they find out through their networks and through social media. And the progenitor, the primary influencer through these channels are what we call KOLs, or key opinion leaders. These can be celebrities, fashionistas, bloggers, and others who actually build up loyal followings on these social platforms and provide advice, buying advice, product recommendations, styling advice, beauty education videos that Chinese men and women very much take to heart and use for their actual purchases. Think about something like Man Repeller, but on steroids, where there are many man repellers and much more influential within the communities.
Very cool. So, Brian, I want to spend a couple of minutes now that we're talking about everything you guys have achieved so far and go back to November 2011, the genesis of Bomoda. You're a fan of blue sky opportunities. Take us back to those early days.
Yeah, so I had been working in corporate America for a number of years by November 2011, and I had done pretty well at some large companies doing entrepreneurial businesses like helping start Hulu and running the NBC side of that for NBC Universal and a few other projects. And I knew it was time for me to do something entrepreneurial. Effectively, I realized I would no longer be a good employee for anybody else. I felt like I knew too much and I knew better, and I wanted to be my own boss. But I was looking for an opportunity where I saw both a large and growing market, but also a relatively limited competitive set. And so I was actually having drinks with a Chinese woman who had been living in London, and then she had moved to Dubai and then back to London. And I had asked her what she had seen since she got back to London. She said, gosh, there's been this massive influx of Chinese tourists and expats flooding the city, walking around with bags of cash looking for ways to spend it. And I just thought that was an interesting statement and very different from what we were seeing in the United States, especially in mid-2011, as we were still feeling
No bags of cash.
No bags of cash, financial crisis, economic consumer confidence downturn. And when I started to research this consumer, I saw a group that had gone from 6% of the global luxury market to 30% in a little over half a decade. I saw new millionaires being printed every day at the fastest rate in the history of the world. I saw an incredibly aspirational, consumer-centric middle class that had gone from a relatively limited number to hundreds of millions. I saw a society that was, while less affluent than Western societies, traditional Western societies, much more consumer and spending driven at this point, much more aspirational, much more upwardly mobile, and lastly, with a lower level of socioeconomic spending power, but on the flip side, the ability to spend much more of their average take-home pay on consumer goods. So it just seemed like a great opportunity. And when I started to look at how Western brands were accessing these consumers and the platforms through which these Western brands were getting access, I just thought that there was a big hole. And although I knew nothing about China, although I'd never traveled there, I liked the food, that was about it. I decided to start Bomoda.
Brian, what was the difference, like certainly at NBC in a role like you, executive vice president? It's a lot of responsibility, but life as a founder is completely different.
It is a lot more enjoyable, a lot lower pay until you get there, until you get to the some type of exit or big big build, but also a lot more difficult. And the reason why I say that is at NBC, when we started Hulu, we had the benefit of hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of content. We had lots of press, we had lots of interest, we had a built-in consumer base just waiting to be turned on. When you start a startup, you're basically taking two sticks together, rubbing them together, and creating fire. And then you actually have to go find somebody who wants to pay you for the fire that you created. And that's just a much more difficult endeavor. But if you can do it, then it's so much more worthwhile because you've created something out of nothing, and you've built enough value in that creation that other people are actually willing to pay you for something that they hadn't previously paid for. One of the things that I'm most proud about with Bomoda, but also something that makes it more difficult, is we're not just building something new in the sense that we haven't just started a new company, but brands are paying us for things that they never had paid for before, in the sense that this is a new market for them. They have to recognize the opportunity, they have to recognize the hurdles that they have right now, and then they have to be willing to write a check, obviously, to us because they believe that we can help them clear those hurdles for a problem that we've articulated for them. And that's been an amazing and gratifying experience.
As you put it in that light, it lends back to something you shared that really, really stayed with me. When you talked about the difference of being intrapreneurial and entrepreneurial at your own company. So you said, it's nothing but you, your co-founders, and an idea. And I think that puts it so well because in the early days, that's all you have.
Very much so. So when I started Bomoda, I had one co-founder who I was talking to about joining, but really it was just me when I first started. And I left my prior company on a Friday, and I started working at Bomoda or on Bomoda on the next Monday. And I had called a friend of mine who had excess office space. I asked if I could rent it from him. He gave me a good deal. And so I went into a room that would ultimately fit 20 people, and I sat at a table by myself.
Oh, geez.
And I think everybody who worked at the company that I was renting from thought I was insane because I was sitting at a table that was a table for 8 people, and I was sitting there by myself for the first 3 weeks. But the reason why I did that was because I wanted to get started. I was so excited about this. And what you find is, in the early going, there are a million reasons why you should probably give up. You find out that somebody's doing something relatively similar. You find out that customers aren't quite as ready to pay as you thought. You find out that the technology will be more difficult to build than you had previously imagined. You find out that the cost will be higher than you likely had budgeted. But then you say to yourself, if it was easy, everybody would be doing it. And I know what the upside opportunity is. I know what the value that we can create is. And that's why, obviously, if you do have co-founders, it's a lot easier because everybody's going to have that day where they wake up and say, it'd be really nice to get back at a big company, to get a good paycheck, to get great benefits, to fly business class and travel the world. Startup is very different. And if you have a co-founder, and actually one of my co-founders, for instance, was my brother-in-law, you can drive each other forward when you're having one of those darker or less optimistic moments.
Now that you are where you are with the success that you've had, when you look back, what are some of the early challenges that were really difficult for you guys to overcome?
Yeah, so one thing I guess I'd mention is I still don't feel like we're successful. So I look at everything as different steps in a permissioning process where I know I'm at step F out of A to Z, and I've gotten past A, B, C, D, and E, but I still know I have a long way to go. And each step of permission is, can I grow a little bit more? Can I launch a more valuable product? To get permission to grow, to get permission to get that bigger customer, whatever it might be. So that's maybe part of my mindset that keeps me driven and moving forward. Back to the question. I'm sorry, what was the question?
Just some of the early challenges that at the time seemed very big.
Yeah, so problems at the very beginning that seemed really big. One was one of my original co-founders actually quit after 3 weeks.
Oh, no. And
she was our Chinese co-founder. So it was effectively my American brother-in-law and myself working on a business for the China market and Western brands, and we didn't have anybody. So I wound up reaching out to the Columbia Business School China Society and got the wife of one of the business school students there who happened to be Chinese, and she wound up joining as effectively our third co-founder. That was a scary moment. Another scary moment was realizing that raising capital was going to be more difficult than I thought it would be, and ultimately we put in a couple $100,000 of our own money to build the business, to get the product out the door before we were able to raise capital. So at some point you start writing checks and you're paying everybody's salary, you're paying for office space, you're paying for computers and hardware and software and storage, and then you say, "Am I ever going to get this money back?" So that was certainly a moment. There were a couple moments early on where we were concerned that there were competitors doing things that were very similar to what we were doing, and I thought that might cause major issues. But honestly, there was never a day where I thought, I'm going to fold up shop. I've never had that moment. My wife has always been very supportive, although she was my fiance when we started. We now have a child and another one on the way, and it's become a little bit of a family endeavor. She comes in, works with us 2 days a week. I've never really looked back and said, at that moment, we almost quit. It's more just, we're going to keep going until we build either a real company that's large and substantial and valuable, or we'll die trying.
I love it. And before we go, I just want to touch on two of those points. For bootstrapping, is there something you wish you would have known when you were doing it?
Yeah, absolutely. So two things. One is, know that raising capital is more difficult than you think it will be. Unless you've had a $500 million exit in your past, or unless you have a very rich father who's going to write you a check or something, it's difficult. And for instance, we wound up raising more money than we expected to, but it took us more work than I expected it to. So just be ready for that emotional side. And you're going to be out there trying to build your product, and then you're going to wind up spending 80% of your time trying to raise capital. So it creates an interesting dynamic. The other thing that I would say is make sure you have real subject matter expertise at your company. Even though you're really smart, even though you have great co-founders, try and have people involved who really have walked in the shoes of what you're trying to build. In the sense that if you're building a SaaS product, make sure you have people involved in the development who have built SaaS products. If you're building a consumer business, make sure you have somebody on the marketing side who has actually scaled a consumer play before. Whatever it might be, make sure you have the right people sitting around the table. The reason why I say that is because especially when you're spending your own money, you can't afford to make expensive mistakes. And oftentimes, very smart people make rational, logical decisions that seem to make sense, but there may be some small intrinsic issue with an industry that means that what seems logical is actually not the right thing to do, and you won't know that unless you have somebody around the table. It could be an advisor or other who can point that out to you before you make that expensive mistake.
Very valuable advice. Last question. We're
Please.
sitting here, and it's 5 years from now, and there's a big cover story coming out about Bomoda. What do you want the headline to be, and how about the picture?
Sure. So hopefully the picture is a picture of our team, and our team is this multi-ethnic, multinational, incredibly diverse organization that represents what we're trying to do here. And what we're trying to do here is really, not to use a Tom Friedman cliche, but flatten the earth. What we're seeing with the Chinese consumer is just the tip of the iceberg. The future buyer, the growth in the market will come from sub-Saharan Africa. It will come from the Middle East. It will come from Asia. It will come from Latin America. It's not going to come from traditional buyers in Western Europe or in North America. And we want Bomoda to be the intelligence platform that helps brands understand those consumers as easily and as well and as proactively as they understand the consumer in their own backyard. And if we can be the open sesame, the platform through which brands truly understand that global consumer, we've won.
All right, well, I can't wait to watch you guys do that. How can everyone stay up to date with you and stay up to date with Bomoda and all of the great work you guys are doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can check us out at bomoda.com, BOMODA.com, or our Twitter handle is Bomoda. And we post on our website frequent press mentions. We're fortunate enough to be seen at this point as a subject matter expert on the Chinese consumer. So lots of interesting literature up there and thought pieces.